The room was quiet. Not the empty quiet of a forgotten place, but the heavy, dense quiet of a room where a single word could shift fortunes, end lives, or begin wars. Antonio Moretti sat behind a desk carved from a dark, ancient wood that had outlived kings. He was an old man now. The fire that had forged an empire in the city's underbelly had cooled to embers deep within his eyes. But embers could still burn. They could still set the world ablaze if stirred. His hands, spotted with age but still possessing a latent, coiled strength, rested on a single, closed manila folder. It was thin. Unassuming. Yet it was the only thing on the vast, polished surface of his desk. For 50 years, it had been the first thing he looked at in the morning and the last thing he saw at night. A soft, respectful knock came at the door. One knock. A pause. Then another. It was a code. A rhythm of deference learned over decades. Enter, Marco. The voice was a low rumble, gravel over silk. It held the same authority it had 50 years ago, just with more weariness. Marco Vella slipped into the room, closing the heavy door behind him without a sound. He was a man in his late 60s, with a face like a roadmap of loyalty and worry. He had been Antonio's shadow since they were boys stealing bread on the docks. He was the only person left alive who called the boss by his first name, and even then, only when they were alone. He stood before the desk, his hands clasped behind his back. He did not speak. He waited. That was the rule. The boss spoke first. Antonio did not look up from the folder. He seemed to be staring through it, through the wood of the desk, through the very foundations of the building, into a time long past. "What is it?" Antonio asked, his voice still distant. "It's about the arrangement," Marco said, his tone careful. "The one for the apartment on Elm Street. Number 4". Antonio's eyes finally lifted. The embers flickered. "What about it?" The property manager called. "The payments will no longer be necessary." A long silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken history. Marco shifted his weight, a subtle, nervous gesture from a man who was never nervous. "She passed away, Antonio," Marco said softly. "The old woman. Elena Rossi. She passed in her sleep 2 nights ago. It was peaceful," they said. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. Antonio's face, a mask of controlled impassivity for half a century, showed a crack. It was not grief, not exactly. It was something deeper. The look of a man watching a landmark from his own soul crumble into dust. He did not speak. He simply lowered his gaze back to the folder. His hand, the one that had signed orders and shaken the hands of powerful men, trembled for a single, fleeting moment. Marco saw it. He had seen that hand break a man's jaw with a single backhand. He had seen it hold a dying friend. He had never, in 60 years, seen it tremble. "Boss?" Antonio raised his other hand, a quiet, absolute gesture to stop. To say no more. He sat there, a statue of a king in his throne room, the world he commanded fading away, leaving only the silence and the thin folder on his desk. He finally took a slow, deliberate breath. "Make the arrangements," he said, his voice strained. "The funeral. Pay for everything. The best of everything. Do it anonymously. A grant from a historical society. A forgotten insurance policy. I do not care what you invent. Her son is not to know. No one is to know." Marco nodded slowly. "Of course, Antonio. But this is?" "Do it," Antonio repeated, the steel returning to his voice. Marco bowed his head slightly and turned to leave. He knew better than to ask why. For 50 years, that monthly payment had been a mystery, a strange, gentle thread in the violent tapestry of their lives. A secret he had never been allowed to understand. As the door clicked shut, Antonio Moretti, the ghost of the city, finally opened the folder. Inside was a single, yellowed lease agreement from 1973. And tucked beside it, a small, faded photograph of a young woman with tired eyes and a hopeful smile, holding the hand of a little boy. He stared at the photo, and the quiet, heavy room filled with the ghosts of a memory he had carried alone for 5 decades. A memory of rain and blood and the taste of charity. 50 years ago, Antonio Moretti was not a king. He was a wolf. Young, hungry, and vicious. He was an enforcer for the old guard, a man whose name was spoken in whispers in the dark corners of the city. His reputation was his armor, forged in the fires of back alley brawls and ruthless ambition. He moved through the world with a predator's grace, his eyes constantly scanning for weakness, for opportunity. His world was governed by a simple, brutal code. Strength was respected. Loyalty was rewarded. Betrayal was erased. And sentiment? Sentiment was a disease. A weakness that could get a man killed. He had learned this lesson as a child. He grew up in a tenement that smelled of boiled cabbage and despair. He remembered his mother, a woman with perpetually chapped hands and a sadness in her eyes that never left. He remembered her face, pale and tight, every time the landlord came to the door. A fat, sweating man named Signore Gallo, who would loom in their doorway, his presence sucking the very air from their small apartment. He remembered the shame. The fear. The cold knot of helplessness in his stomach as he watched his mother plead for another week, another day. He remembered the way Gallo would look at her, a leering, possessive gaze that made young Antonio's fists clench until his knuckles were white. One day, Gallo went too far. He had put a hand on his mother's arm, his voice a greasy whisper suggesting other ways she could pay the rent. Antonio, all of 12 years old, had flown at him, a tiny, furious whirlwind of fists and teeth. Gallo had laughed, swatting him away like a fly. He had backhanded his mother across the face for raising such a disrespectful brat. That was the day the boy died and the wolf was born. He had looked at the red mark on his mother's cheek and made a vow. He would never be helpless again. He would never be weak. He would become so strong that men like Gallo would tremble at the sound of his name. He would own the buildings. He would own the men. He would own the fear. And he had. By his early 20s, he was already a legend. He took what he wanted. He built his power on a foundation of fear and an unwavering, brutal efficiency. He cut all sentiment from his heart, cauterizing the wounds of his childhood with cold, hard cash and colder, harder violence. His mother had passed away by then, worn down by a life of hard work and worry. He had bought her a gravestone of the finest marble, a monument to a promise kept too late. He visited it once a year, a silent, grim ritual to remind himself of why he could never, ever be weak. Elena Rossi lived in a world, a universe away from Antonio's, though it was only a few city blocks. Her world was small, contained within the 4 walls of a 4th-floor walk-up on Elm Street. It was a world that smelled of laundry soap and the simple tomato sauce she made for her son, Leo. She was a widow. Her husband, a good, honest construction worker, had fallen from a scaffold 2 years prior, leaving her with a 5-year-old boy and a heart full of memories. She was a woman of profound, quiet decency. She worked 2 jobs. By day, she sewed sleeves at a garment factory, her fingers nimble but always sore. By night, she scrubbed floors at an office building downtown, her knees aching as she moved the heavy bucket of grey water across endless linoleum tiles. Her life was a constant, exhausting calculation of pennies. Milk or bread? A new pair of shoes for Leo or fixing the leak in the sink? Every day was a battle against the rising tide of bills, a tide that threatened to pull her and her son under. Yet, her apartment was an island of warmth and care. It was clean. A small, resilient flower sat in a jam jar on the windowsill. Leo's crayon drawings were taped to the peeling paint of the kitchen wall. She would sing to him at night, soft lullabies from the old country, her voice a gentle shield against the harsh noises of the city, the sirens, the shouting, the rattling of the elevated train. Her greatest fear was the first of the month. That was when Rico came. Rico was the building's landlord. He was a small man who tried to make himself big with a cheap suit and a sneer that never left his face. He was not powerful like Antonio Moretti. He was a bottom feeder, a parasite who thrived on the misery of others. He knew Elena was alone. He knew she was struggling. And he enjoyed it. He would knock on her door, always in the evening, when he knew she would be tired. He would stand too close, his eyes roaming over her, making her feel dirty. He would find new fees. A charge for a scuff mark in the hall. A penalty for a late payment, even when she was on time. He was always looking for an excuse to squeeze her, to push her closer to the edge. "Times are tough, Elena," he would say, his voice slick with false sympathy. "Maybe we can work something out. A special arrangement. For a pretty woman like you." She would always flinch, pulling her worn sweater tighter around herself. She would give him the rent money, her hand shaking, and close the door, leaning against it until her heart stopped pounding. She lived in a state of constant, low-grade terror. She was a good person trapped in a bad situation, praying for a miracle she knew would never come. She did not know that her life, and the life of the wolf, were about to collide in a dark, rain-slicked alley. The night it happened, the sky wept over the city. A cold, relentless autumn rain that turned the streets to black mirrors and filled the gutters with grimy water. For Antonio, it was the perfect night for war. A deal had gone sour. A rival crew, the Falcone brothers, had tried to move in on his territory. A meeting had been arranged to discuss the matter. Antonio knew it was an ambush. He went anyway. That was his way. You never showed fear. You walked into the lion's den and dared it to bite. It had bitten. Hard. The meeting was a hail of gunfire. Antonio and his men fought back with practiced ferocity, but they were outnumbered. He took a bullet in his side, a hot, searing pain that stole his breath and sent a wave of sickness through him. Another grazed his shoulder. He managed to escape, leaving 2 of his men behind as he stumbled into the labyrinth of back alleys he knew better than the lines on his own hand. He was bleeding badly. The rain washed the blood away, but he could feel the life draining out of him, a warm wetness spreading beneath his coat. He was losing strength, his vision blurring at the edges. He needed to get off the street. He needed a place to hide, to stop the bleeding, to think. He found himself in the alley behind a row of tenements on Elm Street. A dead end. Garbage cans overflowed, the stench of rotting food thick in the wet air. He leaned against the cold, damp brick wall, gasping for breath. The pain was a living thing inside him now, clawing at his insides. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in a blaze of glory, but bleeding out next to a pile of garbage. The irony was not lost on him. He thought of his mother. He thought of her face when Signore Gallo had hit her. He had sworn to never be weak again, yet here he was, at his weakest. Helpless. Through the haze of pain, a sound cut through the drumming of the rain. It was faint, but clear. A woman's voice. Singing. He looked up, his eyes focusing on a single lit window on the 4th floor. He could see the silhouette of a woman holding a small child, swaying back and forth. She was singing a lullaby, the same one his own mother used to sing to him. The simple, gentle melody was so out of place in his world of violence and death that it felt like a hallucination. He watched, mesmerized. The woman in the window represented everything he had lost, everything he had cut out of himself. A life of simple warmth. Of love. Of peace. It was a world he could see but never, ever enter. He slid down the wall, his legs giving out. The world was starting to spin. He pressed his hand hard against the wound in his side, but the blood just seeped through his fingers. He was getting cold. So very cold. Then, a door squeaked open at the end of the alley. A rectangle of yellow light cut through the darkness. A figure emerged, holding a small bag of trash. It was her. The woman from the window. Elena Rossi stepped into the rain, her head ducked against the downpour. She walked toward the garbage cans, her mind on her sleeping son and the long night of scrubbing floors that lay ahead of her. She did not see him at first. He was just another shadow in an alley full of them. She tossed the bag into a bin and turned to go back inside. Her foot slipped on the wet pavement, and as she caught her balance, her eyes fell upon the slumped figure against the wall. Her breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was pure fear. This was how people disappeared. This was the city's darkness reaching out for her. A man, bleeding in an alley. You screamed. You ran. You locked your door and pretended you saw nothing. That was how you survived. She saw his face, pale in the dim light. He was young, his features sharp and handsome despite the pain etched upon them. He was not looking at her with menace. He was looking at her with a kind of desperate, animal vulnerability. He looked like he was dying. And in that moment, something shifted in her. She didn't see a gangster, a criminal, a threat. She saw the ghost of her husband after his accident. She saw the terror in the eyes of a stray dog she had once fed. She saw a human being in agony. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear against compassion. Run, her mind screamed. Help him, her heart whispered. Antonio watched her, his hand inching toward the gun tucked in his waistband. If she screamed, he would have to silence her. He didn't want to. He was tired of violence. But survival was a ruthless master. He braced himself. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She took a hesitant step toward him. Then another. You are hurt, she said, her voice barely a whisper, almost lost in the sound of the rain. He just stared at her, saying nothing. He couldn't believe it. This woman, this complete stranger, was walking toward a bleeding man in a dark alley instead of away from him. It was the stupidest, most reckless, most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Wait here, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of resolve. She turned and hurried back inside, disappearing into the yellow light. Antonio was stunned. He was sure it was a trick. She was calling the police. She was calling for help. He tried to push himself to his feet, to run, but his body refused to obey. He was trapped. A minute later, the door opened again. She was back. In one hand, she held a thick, clean dish towel. In the other, a glass of water and a small, crusty piece of bread. She knelt beside him in the filthy, wet alley, her worn dress soaking up the grimy water. She didn't seem to notice or care. She held out the towel. For the bleeding, she said softly. Press this against it. Hard. He took it, his blood-slicked fingers brushing against hers. He pressed the clean cloth to his side. The pressure was agony, but it was a grounding pain. Then she offered him the bread and water. You look pale, she said. You must eat something. He stared at the offering as if it were a holy sacrament. He, Antonio Moretti, who could buy entire restaurants, who ate the finest food and drank the most expensive wine, was being offered a crust of bread and tap water by a poor woman who probably had barely enough for herself. He took the glass, his hand shaking, and drank. The water was cold and clean, the most incredible thing he had ever tasted. It was life. He took the bread and ate it slowly, the simple taste of flour and yeast filling his senses. She watched him, her expression a mixture of fear and pity. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask who had shot him. She didn't ask what he was doing in her alley. She simply saw a need and filled it. It was an act of pure, uncalculated humanity. In that moment, something inside Antonio, a part of him he thought had died with his mother, cracked open. This woman's kindness was a light in the absolute darkness of his life. It was a debt. And Antonio Moretti always paid his debts. Thank you, he rasped, the words feeling foreign and inadequate on his tongue. You should go, she said, her fear finally starting to win. It is not safe for you here. For me. He nodded, gathering the last of his strength. He used the wall to pull himself to his feet, swaying unsteadily. He looked down at her, this small, brave woman kneeling in the filth for a stranger. He wanted to say something, to promise her something, but the words wouldn't come. He just held her gaze for a long moment, memorizing her face. Then he turned and limped away, melting back into the shadows from which he came, leaving her alone in the rain with a blood-soaked towel. He had entered that alley a wolf. He left it as something else. A protector. It took Antonio a week to recover. He holed up in a safe house, tended to by a quiet, discreet doctor who knew not to ask questions. During that week, he did nothing but think. He replayed the scene in the alley over and over in his mind. The sound of her singing. The fear in her eyes. The feel of the clean towel. The taste of the bread and water. It became an obsession. That single act of kindness had lodged itself deep in his soul. In his world, every action had a motive. Greed. Power. Revenge. Her action had none of these. It was selfless. It was pure. And in his corrupted world, purity was the rarest and most valuable commodity of all. He owed her. The debt was not monetary. It was deeper. It was a matter of honor. She had saved his life, not just by giving him the strength to escape, but by reminding him that a flicker of humanity still existed in the world. He had to protect that light. He had to keep it safe from the darkness. His darkness. The first thing he did when he was back on his feet was to send for Marco. "I need you to find someone for me," he said, his voice cold and all business. "A woman. Lives on Elm Street. 4th floor. She has a young son." Marco, ever efficient, returned 2 days later with a full report. Elena Rossi. Widow. 2 jobs. Struggling. And a landlord named Rico who was making her life a living hell. As Marco detailed Rico's harassment, the way he squeezed her for money and made lewd suggestions, Antonio felt a cold, familiar fury build inside him. It was the same rage he had felt as a boy, watching Signore Gallo loom over his mother. Rico was Gallo. The same kind of parasite. The same kind of bully who preyed on the weak because he was too cowardly to face the strong. And now, he was preying on her? The woman who had shown him kindness when he was bleeding in the dirt. This was unacceptable. It was a violation of a code that was forming in Antonio's mind, a code that went beyond the rules of the street. You do not harm children. You do not disrespect women. And you do not, under any circumstances, torment the innocent. "Get the car," Antonio said to Marco, his voice dangerously quiet. "We are going to pay Mr. Rico a visit." Marco raised an eyebrow. "Just the 2 of us?" "Boss, if this is about the Falcones." "This is not about the Falcones," Antonio cut him off. "This is personal." They found Rico in the dingy, closet-sized office he kept in the basement of the building. He was counting a greasy stack of bills, a smug look on his face. He looked up as the 2 tall, imposing figures filled his doorway, and his smugness instantly evaporated, replaced by a twitchy fear. He didn't know Antonio by sight, but he knew power when he saw it. He knew these were not men who had come to complain about a leaky faucet. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice suddenly thin and reedy. Antonio stepped into the room, his presence making the small space feel even smaller. He didn't look at Rico. He let his eyes wander over the cheap paneling, the dusty filing cabinets, the general air of squalor. Marco stood by the door, a silent, menacing statue. "You are the landlord here," Antonio stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes, that's right." "Rico." "I own this building," he said, puffing out his chest a little, a foolish attempt to reclaim some authority. Antonio finally turned his gaze on him. Rico felt that gaze like a physical blow. It was cold, analytical, and utterly devoid of mercy. "We are here to discuss one of your tenants," Antonio said, his voice calm. "Elena Rossi. Apartment for Inch." Rico's face soured. "Ah, her. Always late with the rent, that one. What about her? She send you to talk to me?" "Because if she did." She does not know we are here, Antonio said, taking a slow step forward. And she is not late with the rent. You, however, have been adding certain, unofficial fees to her bill. Rico started to sweat. I don't know what you're talking about. You also have been making suggestions to her, Antonio continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Suggestions about how she might be able to pay you, other than with money. He took another step. He was standing directly in front of Rico's desk now, towering over him. Let me tell you a story, Rico, Antonio said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of a death sentence. There was a woman. A widow. Working 2 jobs to feed her son. She had nothing. One night, she found a man dying in her alley. A stranger. A man who could have hurt her. Instead of running, she gave him a drink of water. She gave him her last piece of bread. Antonio leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. Rico flinched as if he'd been struck. That woman, Rico, has more honor in her little finger than you have in your entire pathetic life. She is a good person. And in this world, good people are to be protected. You are not a good person. You are a rat who feeds on scraps. And you have been chewing on something that belongs to me. Rico's face had gone ashen. Belongs to you? I didn't know she was with you. I swear, if I had known. She is not with me, Antonio snarled, the mask of calm finally slipping. She does not even know my name. That is the point. You do not torment people because you think they are alone. You do not prey on the weak because you think no one is watching. Because someone is always watching. The message was clear. I am watching. What happened next was swift and silent. Marco stepped forward. Rico opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Rico was never seen again. The official story was that he sold the building and moved to Florida overnight. No one questioned it. No one really cared. He was not the kind of man who was missed. A week later, a lawyer from a downtown firm, representing a newly formed property company, informed the tenants that their building had been sold. Rents would be frozen. Repairs would be made. For Elena Rossi in apartment 4, the letter contained a special addendum. Due to a clerical review, it was determined her late husband's union had a life insurance policy that had gone unclaimed. The policy would now be used to cover her rent. In full. For the rest of her life. Elena wept when she read the letter. She looked at the sky and thanked God. She thanked her late husband. She believed it was a miracle. She never knew that her guardian angel was a man who lived in the shadows, a man who was, at that very moment, looking at the new deed to her building, a silent promise finally fulfilled. The first payment on a debt he would spend the rest of his life repaying. And so, 50 years passed. The world changed. The city grew, its skyline transforming into a forest of glass and steel. Antonio's empire grew with it. He became the undisputed king, a ghost who pulled the strings from the quiet of his study. He accumulated wealth beyond measure and power that made politicians tremble. And every month, like clockwork, a payment was made from a subsidiary of a subsidiary, a ghost in the machine, covering the rent for apartment 4 on Elm Street. It was a single, unwavering constant in a life of chaos and violence. Now, he stood at the back of a small, somber chapel, a shadow among the mourners. He was just another old man in a dark suit, his face lost in the crowd. No one gave him a second glance. He watched Elena's son, Leo, stand at the podium. He was a man in his mid-50s now, with his mother's kind eyes and a quiet confidence. He was a doctor, Antonio knew. A heart surgeon. One of the best in the city. He had a wife and 2 children of his own, sitting in the front pew. A good family. A good life. Leo cleared his throat and began to speak about his mother. He spoke of her kindness, her resilience, her unwavering love. My mother was a simple woman, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She didn't have much, but she gave everything she had. She believed in the goodness of people, even when the world gave her every reason not to. He paused, looking out at the faces in the chapel. There was always a little mystery in our lives, he continued. When I was a boy, we struggled. I remember my mother being so worried about the rent, about a horrible landlord we had. And then, one day, it all just stopped. The landlord disappeared. Our rent was suddenly paid for. My mother was told it was an old insurance policy of my father's. Leo smiled a sad, gentle smile. She called it the miracle on Elm Street. She believed an angel was watching over us. For the rest of her life, she never had to worry about a roof over her head. She was able to save, to give me the education she never had. Everything I am, everything I have, I owe to her, and to that angel. Antonio stood perfectly still, his face unreadable. He was no angel. He was the furthest thing from it. He had done monstrous things in his life. He had built his kingdom on fear and blood. But for this one family, in this one small way, he had been allowed to play the part of a protector. He had kept one small corner of the world safe. After the service, he stood by the graveside, watching from a distance as they lowered the casket into the earth. Marco appeared at his side, holding a black umbrella to shield him from a light drizzle that had begun to fall. "It is done, boss," Marco said quietly. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the family grieve. Finally, Marco could not hold it in any longer. The question that had been a silent presence between them for 5 decades. "Antonio," he began, using the name he reserved for moments of true gravity. "I have to ask. I have been with you my whole life. I have seen you give orders that changed this city. I have seen you be ruthless and I have seen you be generous. But this was different. 50 years. You never met her again. You never spoke to her. Why? Why this woman?" Antonio did not look at him. His eyes were fixed on the grave, on the fresh mound of earth. "When we were boys, Marco," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Do you remember my mother? Do you remember Signore Gallo?" Marco's face tightened. "I remember. I swore that day I would burn men like him from the world," Antonio continued. "I became a monster to fight monsters. I built an empire of shadows so I would never be helpless again. And I lost myself in it. I forgot what it was I was even fighting for." He finally turned to look at his old friend, his eyes holding the weight of a lifetime of secrets. "That night, in that alley. I was dying. I was as helpless as my mother ever was. I was nothing. And she, who had nothing, gave me everything. Not just bread and water. She reminded me what a good person looked like. She reminded me of my mother. She reminded me of the boy I used to be." He paused, the rain pattering softly on the umbrella. "I couldn't let the world crush her like it crushed my mother," he said. "I couldn't let men like Rico win. So I built a wall around her life. A wall she never saw. I paid her rent because it was the only way I could pay the debt. It was never about the money, Marco. It was about keeping one good thing in this world pure." He looked back at the family. Leo was comforting his children. "She thought it was an angel," Antonio said with a hint of a sad smile. "Let her have that. Let her son believe that." He straightened his suit jacket. "It is time to go." As they were leaving, he saw Leo standing alone by his car. On an impulse, Antonio changed course. He walked toward him. Leo looked up, startled, as the old man approached. "Mr. Rossi," Antonio said, his voice polite, formal. "My condolences. Your mother was a fine woman." "Thank you," Leo said, studying the old man's powerful face. "I'm sorry, have we met?" "No," Antonio said. "I am just an old friend of the neighborhood. I knew your mother a very, very long time ago. She did me a kindness once. I never forgot it." He reached into his coat and pulled out a simple, elegant business card. It had no name, no company. just a single phone number embossed in gold. He pressed it into Leo's hand. "Your mother is gone, but the debt remains," Antonio said softly. "If you or your family ever need anything at all, you call this number. It will be taken care of." Leo looked down at the card, then back up at the old man, confused. "I don't understand." "You do not need to," Antonio said. He gave a slight, formal nod, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the grey afternoon with his shadow, Marco, at his side. 3 years passed. The old neighborhood, once a place of struggle, was seeing a new kind of life. A state-of-the-art medical clinic had opened in a refurbished community center. It was called the Elena Rossi Memorial Clinic. It provided free healthcare to the families who lived there, to the working poor, to those who had nowhere else to turn. It was run by Dr. Leo Rossi. The clinic had been made possible by a single, massive, anonymous donation from a philanthropic trust no one had ever heard of. Leo, honoring his mother's spirit, poured his heart and soul into it, providing the kind of compassionate care that was a rarity in the modern world. He was continuing her legacy of kindness. Miles away, in a quiet study, Antonio Moretti sat behind his great wooden desk. He was frailer now, the embers in his eyes burning low. He was looking at the thin manila folder, as he did every day. But now, next to the faded photo of the young woman, there was a new clipping from the newspaper. It showed a smiling Dr. Rossi cutting the ribbon at his new clinic. A knock came at the door. The familiar 1-2 rhythm. Marco entered, carrying a tray with a glass of water and some medication. He was older, too, his movement slower. He set the tray on the desk and looked at the newspaper clipping. "He is a good man," Marco said. His mother would be proud. "She was a good woman," Antonio replied, his voice a faint whisper. "Goodness creates goodness. Like ripples in a pond." He picked up the glass of water and held it, looking at his own reflection in it. He thought of the alley. He thought of the rain. He thought of the first glass of water she had given him. The start of it all. He had spent his life taking. He had taken territory, businesses, lives. But his greatest legacy, the thing that gave him a sliver of peace in his final days, was not what he had taken. It was what he had given. A lifetime of safety, bought with a piece of bread and a glass of water. A silent, 50-year promise to a woman who died never knowing his name, but who had, in one small moment of grace, saved his soul. For in a world of monsters and shadows, the most powerful act of all is not the exercise of strength, but the protection of innocence. A single act of kindness, no matter how small, can echo through generations, a quiet testament to the fact that even in the darkest of nights, one small light, if carefully guarded, can illuminate the world.